Greetings, Mage fans. This is Adam Simpson talking to you for Mage the Podcast, and today I am joined by well-known Mage fan Dr. Anders Sandberg, who is currently in Oxford in the United Kingdom. Good morning, Dr. Sandberg.
Good morning, Adam. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing very well today. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. A lot of Mage fans are still familiar with the work that you did on Anders' Mage page, which was, I believe, back in the 1990s.
Yeah, I got onto the internet in 1991, and then I found the web when it was invented in 92, 93. So I just started making pages. And of course, being a fan of Mage, I had to make some Mage pages.
Yes, you had quite an extensive website. You had pages on mad scientists, different humor connected to that. You had a transhumanist site, of course, Anders' Mage page, and some other similar topics. So there was really a lot for a person to dive into who found your site. But today I wanted to focus on the section of it called Anders' Mage page, which was something that a lot of us enjoyed quite a lot back in the 1990s when we were playing Mage and running our own chronicles. It was a resource that we kept going back to. So I wanted... Yeah. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to start out by introducing the current work that you do. I understand you're a research fellow with the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. Is this correct?
Yes, indeed. So you could say that now I join the technocracy, or maybe, given that it's Oxford, is the Order of Hermes. Although, given the research we do, that's probably somewhere between the Void Engineers and Virtual Adepts.
You certainly do cover a lot of ground, and it's been very interesting to follow a lot of the talks and interviews that you've given on technological topics and artificial intelligence and catastrophe planning and many other things. So there's really a lot to get into for those who are interested. Now, I understand that you're not originally from the UK. Are you from the country of Sweden?
Yes, indeed. So I grew up in a relatively boring northern suburb of Stockholm, and for 34 years I lived on the same street before going to Oxford and realizing what took me so long.
So you've been at Oxford since then?
Yeah. So I'm slowly going native just in time for Brexit.
Okay. Well, that sounds like you've got a very good place to continue your work over there.
It is a very exciting place because Oxford University has this effect of both being a very good university, so you get a lot of very smart people to throw around ideas with, but it's also a lovely place that is fairly easy to get to. So it's easy to get people to come and visit if you want to chat with them.
Well, that does sound great. Now, how did you get started with the game Magetheascension?
So I've been playing role-playing games since basically high school. At first it was some of a local Swedish role-playing games like Drakar och Demoner and Mutant, but relatively quickly I fell in love with the good old 2300 AD. I really like hard science fiction, so I was running some extensive campaigns in that. And then we heard that there was a new game called Vampire the Masquerade that seemed pretty exciting. So this was my high school gaming group, and we tried it out and really enjoyed this more free-form storyteller form of role-playing. So we started playing Vampire. And then, of course, Mage arrived, and I fell in love.
Now, that, if I remember correctly, that came out in 1993. Was there anything in particular about the game that appealed to you?
Well, I've always been interested in all sorts of philosophical questions, in questions about magic and occultism, as well, of course, as technology and those relationships, the relationship between technology and the worldview, all of that existed in Mage. As well as, of course, the sheer fun of bending reality to your will, which, as somebody who's always been interested in technology, making the thinkable and unthinkable real, this was just my kind of thing.
Yeah, it was much the same elements of the game that attracted me as well. Now, would you say that anything in Mage the Ascension has inspired your current work?
Well, I think to some degree it forced me to think in a much more postmodern way. After all, the core idea in Mage is that reality is actually modified by our personal views. It takes an extremely subjectivist worldview, which I personally don't believe is an actually true representation of how the world metaphysically actually works, but it's a pretty good description of how people think about it. And the battles between different paradigms, that is something that is very relevant if you're working in science, especially if you're an interdisciplinary person. So I'm trained as a computer scientist, and I did my PhD on computational neuroscience, doing computer models of how the brain works, which meant that I got into touch with a lot of people in neuroscience who were already thinking about these issues about memory and the brain very differently from how I would do as a computer person. And then we met the psychologists who quite often forgot about brains when thinking about memory anyway. And I vividly remember the first day when I was taking a psychology course, and I realized that the entire psychology department building was full of people who totally, violently disagreed about what psychology really was about, how you go about doing psychological research, what the relevant questions are, yet they were in the same building. And this, of course, gets even bigger when you go around in academia and start talking to philosophers who can have extremely weird views, talking to economists who have a different set of weird views. And supposedly we're all supposed to work together to make the world a better place. At this point, you start realizing that this is actually a chantry. This is actually the problem of having different traditions deal with each other.
That's a fascinating way to look at that. So you would say that the idea of the traditions being made up of very different groups of people having to work together and find common ground was an idea that occurred to you when you were starting your academic career.
Yeah, and the fundamental problem is that in many disciplines in academia, they have very strong views about what you're supposed and not supposed to do. Not just moral rules, but what's even making sense. So an economist would say, yeah, morality has nothing to do with what we're doing. We're just going to look at what people actually do in an economy. While, of course, in other disciplines, people say it's super important to be normative to figure out what the right thing is. Meanwhile, people over in natural sciences says, guys, we don't really know what you're talking about, those fluffy concepts. We're just going to make stuff that works. And you can do your social construction, whatever it is. Now, the interesting part here is, of course, that in reality, outside the doors of a university, we're supposed to actually fix things. We're supposed to come up with better ways of running society or figuring out what's wrong with society and seeing, can we patch that with some software solution or a robot or maybe a change in the economy. And that requires everybody to work together. But it's really tough because in many cases, even what working together means is different between different groups.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way to look at that. That's something I'm going to certainly be thinking about later. And yes, I do understand how an idea like that would form for someone who has been playing Mage. I think of some of the different published game books and the settings they provide for players that involve chantries where there are many different people who are not only pursuing different kinds of magic but have very different thoughts about what society is currently like and what it should be like, and different methods of achieving goals. So I can certainly see how that kind of thinking would apply to what you're doing.
And of course, playing Vampire before helped me also handle academic intrigue.
Oh, I hope it's not as bad as a typical game of Vampire the Masquerade. That would give me pause.
Well, I think one can learn from the old movie War Games. The only way of winning is not to play. I've seen enough of academic intrigue to realize, yep, I'm not getting into that game, but I know enough to recognize it when I see it and then I run the other way.
I have seen that film, and yes, that is a good way to put that. Well, you set up Anders Mage page, as we've said, and I was hoping you might have some time to let us know what your experience was in making and continuing that website, and also while you were working on it, what responses were you seeing? What feedback were you getting from other Mage fans who visited Anders Mage page?
So it's worth remembering that by today's standard, this is a real fossil. It's the kind of web page you make when you actually sit down and write the HTML code by hand in a text editor. This was before we had even Dreamweaver to actually update web pages. So I was just happily writing it out by hand. And at first it was, of course, just a single page. I just put in some links to some resources that existed, which wasn't that hard because there was maybe 10 pages online about various things. And then they became 20 and I added some texts. And now the page got longer and longer. So eventually I had to split it just to make it easy to browse. And this is, of course, one of the fundamental problems with this old-fashioned way of running web page. Eventually, it just turns into an endless amount of work, especially since links break all the time on the web, and updating that manually, oh dear, that is just such a nightmare. But at the same time, of course, we had the Mage mailing list. So it's worth, and now I'm of course going to sound like a very old guy, talking about mailing lists being really the essential part of the internet back in the early 90s. And they still are an amazing tool because they're so easy to run. You just have a server. You can trust that people with different technologies can use them. And you get this flow of conversation that can also be archived and documented. So that was producing quite often entries that I would later add to the page. And of course, on the list, there was conversations that gave me ideas for how to try to update the pages.
I see. Well, that actually helps me to understand a few of the pieces that I saw. There's a lot of email sort of headers and footer information on those, and I can better understand now how that got to be there. Also, there are some files that I find that are, I believe, a .eml file format, and on my Windows computer those are difficult to view, but on my Macintosh computer they tell my email program to open up and then display it to me. So that does help me understand what I'm experiencing looking at some of the older pieces.
Exactly. For a long while, most of the input was somebody posted something on the Mage list, and I just added that. Which, of course, again, simple technologically speaking, and today we would probably just be clicking some link and have it show up in a Twitter stream or on a blog or something like that. But this was before there was this automation of doing web pages. That arrived kind of mid to late 90s and really changed things. But at that point, of course, I had already become too busy to maintain the Mage page very well.
Yes, a lot of people were sad to see that go offline, but we do have some services that are showing us older snapshots of the site, like Internet Archive and Wayback Machine. So a lot of people are still using those today.
Yeah, I think those services are really essential and they really need to be supported, because one of the fundamental problems with the web was it was intended to organize our knowledge. And of course, knowledge is changing, but we don't want to lose the links. And it's very easy to lose entire sites because they're sitting there passively on somebody's server until it's no longer there. And the real problem is, of course, many of the old things that make other things make sense disappear. So this is why, for example, archives of old mailing lists are so important. And this is why we should support the Internet Archive in the work of actually archiving as much as they possibly can.
Yes, I can certainly agree with that, especially considering how much I use those services myself, not only for viewing your work, but other work as well. So in the earlier days, when you were still active with Anders Mage page, I'm getting the impression that you were actively chatting with people on the mailing list, and then after an interesting piece showed up, I'm assuming you just dropped a line saying, "Hey, that's really good. Can I drop that on Anders Mage page?" Is that okay? So that's how that was happening.
Yep, that was it. It was rather simple.
Yeah, but still, it did give us a lot of good material. On snapshots of the site, there's not only pieces from you, but a lot of other pieces from regular contributors. And I got to wondering, how did they send these in those earlier days of World Wide Web? But now I can put together a complete picture.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to do this kind of internet archaeology because, well, there is that saying that there are 7 internet years per year. By now, of course, this is ancient history, but many things only make sense in the light of history.
Now, were you getting much response from other fans of Mage the Ascension while you were working on the site, or was it something you mostly did in isolation and then heard about later?
Well, I got a fair bit of positive noises from people on the mailing list and occasional emails, and that was, of course, enough to keep me working on it. The interesting part is, of course, that long-term effect. So I noticed this with some of my other web pages because since I was an early adopter, I put on some web pages on certain topics like transhumanism really early. And in the case of transhumanism, I met a large number of people saying, "Oh, I became a transhumanist because I finally learned the word from your page. I always believed these particular views on humanity, and now finally I found my home." Which is, of course, also very heartwarming and also makes you a bit frightened, but because who am I? I just put together some web pages.
Yeah, I do remember some years back there were a number of Mage fans who would just lightly joke that Anders Sandberg is a virtual adept in disguise, and as proof we have his large collection of links to transhumanist pages and articles.
Oh, yeah. Of course, I also had my Mad Science page that might merit membership in the Sons of Ether. And I did have my magic pages, which was mostly centered, of course, on Hermetic magic. And incidentally provided so much good material for mage campaigns.
Yeah, I will have to go back and see if some of that material can also be accessed at this late date. Which leads me to another question. Do you get any responses currently from people who saw Anders Mage page years back? I mean, other than me, of course. Are there any people who talk to you about that?
It happens. It's not that common these days. Partially, unfortunately, because Mage might not be the most popular game around for the time being. But it does happen. It's left a trace, which makes me very happy.
Oh, I see. Now, back when, in the days that you were actively running the game and playing with friends of yours, was there any faction or tradition or convention that particularly interested you, that featured a lot in your games?
Well, I studied a fair bit of Hermetic magic, so I was using the real stuff in my campaigns. And since some of my players were also a little bit of academic overachievers, they had read up too much on it. So we were actually using a fair bit of the Golden Dawn system of magic, Enochian magic, various references to the Goetia. So I vividly remember game sessions where people were actually leafing through actual books bought at the local New Age bookstore, trying to find the right demon to summon.
Oh, that does sound like it would add a lot to a game session. That sounds like you had a very good group of people to game with.
It was really fun.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
A lot of the fun in role-playing is, of course, when you get your gaming group to really shake down together. So everybody roughly knows where the others are coming from, and they get invested in building characters and storylines, especially using their own abilities. So one of my players, he was relatively into Caribbean and South American mythology and beliefs. So he was adding some elements from Quimbada, while others were interested in getting some more technical stuff in. So we had wonderful conversations about virtual adepts and the problems of limited precision in computer numbers. How would that actually affect protective circles? So we had one subplot in a game where a protective circle turned out to be leaking. Bad spirits got out simply because of a numerical error.
You know, that does sound like something that would come up when hermetic magi are getting together and discussing their experiences. Well, it's really a shame that we don't have any sort of records of these games. Of course, it's impossible now, but there are people online who are looking for audio or video recordings of actual play sessions of people with Mage the Ascension. So it is a shame we don't have any of those to see from your own campaigns, or chronicles, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. So back then, of course, we didn't have a digital recording equipment that's trivial to get today. Today, anybody can set up a phone to just record at least the audio, and it doesn't take much work to set a webcam to document what you're doing. I've been delighted, actually, to hear recordings of people playing through some adventures I've written for more recent role-playing games like Eclipse Phase. That has really taught me quite a bit about, this is how people interpret what I'm writing. But the old campaigns, no, they are unfortunately lost. They only exist in our memories.
Yeah. Well, I have not heard of Eclipse Phase myself, but I'm certainly going to look into that after this interview. So you're still hearing from people...
Eclipse Phase...
Oh, no, please continue.
Yeah. So Eclipse Phase is interesting because it's very different. It's a game about transhuman conspiracy and horror set 10 years after the Singularity. And... it's basically intended to be hard science fiction. But I have been toying with the idea that actually one could probably try to play Mage the Ascension in that setting.
Mm-hmm.
Which might be really, really weird, because it's a world essentially running on fairly technocratic grounds, except that you might have the post-human Nephandic horrors around too.
I see. Well, there has been some discussion on the merits and drawbacks of different editions of Mage the Ascension. I'm assuming you're familiar with the first and second editions of that game. Did you have a chance to look at the third edition, also called Revised Edition?
A little bit. So I must admit I'm a total fossil. I'm kind of a first edition person myself. Not because the rules in the first edition actually were that good. I think the second edition did a good job at fixing things. But what I loved about the first edition was the freshness and the possibilities of actually bending it in a lot of different directions. So the different editions, they clarified things and made the world make much more sense. Which, in my opinion, was almost a problem. Because by the point you got to the third edition, now you could actually run it according to the rules fairly well. Except, of course, now there was rules for running the world.
I see. So you think there were some rules innovations with the revised edition?
Well, it's not so much the rules in terms of game system, as it was that it was more and more making the world make somewhat sense. So we all know about the infamous whiskey flask argument. The problem of if I'm protecting myself from getting shot by claiming coincidentally I have that whiskey flask in my pocket and it caught the bullet. And now the question is, do I really need to create that out of matter, or could it just be life magic? And I always tended to say I want magic to be really magical, which means that matter is kind of beside the point. But the matter side kind of won out. People wanted a rule system that made more sense, that was a little bit more structured, which is probably better from a game perspective, but in my opinion, a bit less good for a story perspective.
I think I understand what you're describing. Yes, there were a number of discussions where a lot of people like to focus on details. So someone would say, my mage character got wounded, but I'm going to use some coincidental magic, and according to the rules, I'm going to cast this effect, which causes me to not get injured or to heal the damage that I just received, and I'm going to say to someone, there was this whiskey flask in my pocket that stopped the bullet, and hey, there's no need for me to show that to you. In fact, I don't even need to make a whiskey flask. I'm just going to talk about it, and everyone will think, oh yes, that could happen. And then there's the second group of Mage fans who say, Oh, well, that's not coincidental magic. We need to see an actual whiskey flask. You need to summon, what is it, conjure one or create one, and so we need to be more detailed with how we are applying the rules and considering our coincidental magic.
Exactly. And I don't think either of these ones is wrong per se, but I prefer the first one that makes things much more mythical, much more fluid. It's kind of part of those standard stories where, well, you leave through a door that nobody's mentioned, but there might be a door there, and later it's never referred to, and maybe it doesn't actually exist. It's kind of in mythical time. It's a much more magical world. In the second case, now we get into system. Now we have a lot of rules and ways of maintaining whether you can get a whiskey flask or whether, given your skills and the spheres, you need to teleport a whiskey flask from somewhere and so on. And it depends a little bit on the style, what you want to do. So when I was running my mage campaigns, I wanted to go for that thing of kind of soft magic, magic that actually feels rather magical. But from a game perspective, especially if you have a player who disagrees or whether there might be a conflict between different people trying to do different things, of course you want to have rules that actually cover things in a relatively clear fashion. Now, the storyteller system isn't that bad. Even when you use the rules in a fairly detailed mode, it's nowhere close to Dungeons and Dragons or, heaven forbid, Rollmaster, where there is a table for every contingency.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I do understand what you mean. When I talk with people about games, a lot of people are accustomed to running revised, or they've picked up Mage 20, which is the fourth edition, current edition of the game. And they ask me what I like to run, and I tell them, well, honestly, I like to run second edition with a first edition feel. And
Yeah.
yeah, so back when I was running the first edition and the second edition had not yet come out, one of the things that really helped me was the different pieces on Anders' Mage page. For one example is, first edition had really great concepts and rules that were, although not the best, they were workable. A person could use them at the gaming table and run a fun session. And it was rough around the edges in several aspects of the setting. One example I'm going to throw out there is they had a very poor ability to communicate ideas behind, say, the Akashic Brotherhood. There was a tendency in the early first edition days to simply take anything that was East Asian and toss it into a bin marked Akashic Brotherhood. So anything related to Chinese philosophy or Japanese feudalism or martial arts weapons from any sort of East Asian tradition, they would say, well, must be Akashic Brotherhood. But when I came to Anders' Mage page, I started looking through the different pages you offered for the traditions, and I found a section talking about the Akashic Brotherhood, and it said, hey, let's talk about the paradigm of the Akashics. We're going to see more ideas from Zen Buddhism. We're going to see more ideas from Taoism. There was a quote there from, I believe it's the Chong Tzu. I'm probably pronouncing that terribly, but it was just a piece talking about how two Akashic brothers are discussing the best way to advance in their understanding of magic, and it was quoting how two people from one of the different Taoist traditions was discussing how to advance in their understanding of their philosophy. And this made a lot of sense to me. It made ideas more concrete, and I was able to represent that to my players, saying, oh, yeah, people from the samurai tradition of Japan, they're really not going to have that much to do with the Akashic Brotherhood, but people who were very influenced by Taoist ideas, now you're going to meet those men and women in the Akashic Brotherhood. So it added a lot to my game sessions, and so I really benefited from Anders' Mage page.
That's wonderful to hear. And I also felt that it was fun to try to use this to explore paradigms. So in many cases, this gave me a reason to read up more about small traditions of magic or various religious groups and trying to see what could we use them for.
Yeah. So I agree that there's a lot of good material to be found in the first and second edition of the game, but it's nice that Revised and Mage 20 is also available for those people who prefer to have a finer level of detail and a different way to interact with the rules.
So the tricky part with any game is, of course, how much detail do you want? Because the more detail you have, the easier it is as the storyteller to weave the details in, and players might rely on it. But now you need to study a thick tome of detail. On the other hand, if everything is a bit up in the air, great for improvisation. You can do very fun stuff, but people also have a hard time imagining what's going on. On the other hand, they also don't need to read a big compendium. And this, of course, shows up in most role-playing games. I've been planning a big space opera setting for a long while with some of my friends. And one of the problems is I have about 300 pages of backstory. And I can't expect them to actually read the darn thing. So how do I get them to understand what's going on in this Game of Thrones-like space opera empire? Yeah, it's a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah, I can certainly understand. There seems to be a line drawn between second edition and revised edition, where everything before seems to be the rules light, where a storyteller will read through the rules, get an intuitive understanding of it, internalize it, and then run a game without referring to the books very often. But on the more recent side of that line, with Revised and Mage 20, you have people who are spending more time reading the rules, but they feel assured that different things that might happen in their game are going to be covered, and if they get into trouble, there's some material that they can quickly look up and regain their confidence and continue the game.
Yeah, a lot of this, of course, depends on the kind of game you want to run too. So I tended to run towards a fairly soft and surreal style in my games. So also very odd things could happen in some of my campaigns, which I knew that there is never going to be a rule for a character losing his past, acquiring a past that happens to belong to a fictional character and suddenly gaining an offer of his life. Mm-hmm. That's just so weird that no normal rule system could handle that, and I wouldn't find a way of getting that into a sensible rule system either. But it's such a cool concept, so of course I'm going to use it.
Yeah, I quite agree. It's one of those ideas you don't want to leave on the table.
Yeah, and this is, of course, also why I found that paradox was always contentious how to handle it. And I felt that the best way of using paradoxes is to make the world even more magical and strange. And not all my players liked that. There was one player in particular who really just felt I was punishing him, while I was thinking that, okay, this actually adds to the setting. But most of my players seem to enjoy having their lives getting exceedingly weird when they messed things up.
Well, I would like to give you just a moment to better explain that to our listeners. When you say you used paradox in a way that increased strangeness, was that subjectively for the mage, whereas the rest of the world saw very normal things going on, or were you using what some people call wild paradox, where a paradox flaw could turn a person's skin blue or something like that?
I preferred things that were pretty wild, but probably didn't affect the outside world too much, because then that would kind of defeat the meaning of paradox. So, for example, one virtual adept character, she was messing around with correspondence a lot, gained paradox, and that led to a permanent impairment of her sense of the spatial relations in her own flat. She couldn't find her way around her own flat. That was the paradox.
Oh, I understand. So it was permanent, but at that location. If she moved to a different home, then that would be different.
Exactly. Now, the really fun part here is, of course, what do you do in that situation? Well, in this case, the character decided to just add long threads of yarn with labels on them across the flat. So if she wanted to get to the kitchen, she could just pick up the yarn marked kitchen and follow it. A sensible person would have tried something else, but this was not an exactly sensible person.
Well, that does sound like a lot of fun. Are there any other examples of paradox in your own chronicles that come to mind?
Well, one of the grandest ones was one character who was trying to recover information on a hard drive using time magic and gained an absolutely horrendous amount of paradox. And maybe one should have Wrinkle show up and threaten him or something like that. But I decided that instead he lost his past. Basically, he noticed that beyond 3 years ago, he didn't exist. It was not like he has never existed. No, he just lost his past. Nothing else happened. But to the character, this was very disturbing. There was something like, I don't know what's going to happen to me since my past has kind of disappeared. I need a new past. And this is, of course, where the fun hubris of Mage come in. So he decided, I'm going to try to transplant a new past. And then he did various rituals and he managed to acquire a past. Except that it turned out to be the past of a fictional character, the protagonist in the novel The Red Room by August Strindberg. It was partially because he actually happened to be the character was living in a flat that had belonged to the character, and partially because I wanted to bring in the author August Strindberg into the campaign. Suddenly, the character had a past as this young medical student in 1800 Stockholm. It didn't quite fit, of course, with him being a modern time magic user in the 2000s, but, well, he had a past. Except he suddenly realized that there was an author who could write things into his past. And just because the author happens to be dead in conventional history doesn't mean the author can't affect his past. So suddenly he had to deal with that part of his life was controlled by an external force who could change who he had been.
Oh, that's a fascinating idea. That would be a lot of fun to work with in a chronicle. Well, I'm so glad we're recording this.
Yeah, it was amazingly fun. He had this discussion, very postmodern discussion, sitting in his room, kind of speaking into thin air to his author and trying to rebel. And then August Strindberg, from wherever authors are in relation to the character, told him, do you remember your girlfriend? Now she's dead in chapter 5. And he remembered the grief and, oh no, she is dead. And of course, the author said, I can, of course, write even worse things. So this character actually became a protagonist in fighting against his own author now. August Strindberg turned out to be one of the big bads of this campaign. The campaign itself was also somewhat bizarre because it was a Grail quest. And partially it was the shortest Grail quest ever. It took a weekend. Normally, when you have a story about searches for the Holy Grail, it's all about knights going out on a holy quest and spending years and a lot of trials and tribulations. But in this particular case, there was a very innocent little girl, part of a group of mages, and because of various reasons, various forces wanted her to find the Holy Grail, which turned out to be in an archive of the Royal Castle of Stockholm. And the only reason the Grail quest took a weekend was that it was not open on weekends. And the real backstory was, of course, what is the Grail? What is the Holy Grail? That was what I was thinking about basing the campaign on. And the idea would be that the Grail is, in some sense, the eternal source of quintessence. It's or you can reframe it. It's the inkwell of God. And now if you just have a right pen and the inkwell of God, you can write reality. So there is a true story that during renovations at the Royal Castle in the late 1800s, a young librarian at the Royal Library, that is August Strindberg, the famous author and playwright, he actually found a little reliquary in the statue of St. George and containing various things. And the idea was that maybe that actually did contain something magical. And it turned out to be actually a piece of metal from the lance of Longinus, which is also metaphysically, of course, the pen nib of God. So that allows you as an author to write reality, assuming you have the inkwell, which Strindberg didn't. So now I needed, when writing this campaign, I was thinking, okay, 1800 Stockholm, who could be the antagonist? Who could be the holder of a Holy Grail? And it turned out that there was this big feud between Strindberg and, well, he was feuding with everybody, but there was an explorer, Sven Hedin, This was essentially the last of explorers who managed to fill out an empty spot on the map.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I have Sven Hedin's books on my shelf. Yeah. Please continue. I'm very interested.
Yeah, it's a wonderful coincidence. He was also quite a character. So a lot of my campaign building consists of finding places and random people whom you might bend and put in various ways. So I read some of the stories about Sven Hedin, and he pointed out that he was given a mug by the Dalai Lama or something like that. Now, we have a container here. An explorer is gaining a container. What if I decided that that was the Holy Grail? So I decided that actually the real reason Strindberg and Sven Hedin had this fight was that they're in some sense keepers of these artifacts that should be brought together, but they of course had fundamentally different views on how they should be used and what for. It was all on a very high metaphysical plane. And now the players kind of got the Holy Grail in their hands, partially because getting it out of the hands of Strindberg. And now, of course, the real adventure starts, because now you're handling a really powerful artifact that everybody wants. So a lot of this chronicle was about running away from all the parties that were trying to get at the artifact. One of the funniest elements of the campaign was the Buddhist Nephandi, a bunch of very, very polite Japanese Buddhists who would really, really like you to consider that maybe reality is a bad thing and should be removed. And maybe you could use the Holy Grail to kind of wipe out reality. Just a thought, but please give the compassionate thought to this possibility.
Oh gosh, yeah, that does get my own mind working. I recall some earlier reading of Buddhist thought that an individual wanted to reach the enlightenment, the realization that they did not in fact exist, and that this would end their existence, release them from suffering, and this was a desirable goal. And so if some NPC Nephandus were to change that from the individual to the entire world, then you can have some very interesting discussions from that.
Exactly. So we had them as an interesting both ally and antagonist. Because of the metaphysical assumptions I was making here was that you can never take the Holy Grail from somebody. It must be given freely. Kind of classical, mythical idea. These Nephandi couldn't actually grab it from the little girl carrying it, but they could try to convince her. And of course, they could also somewhat helpfully help against some of the other pursuers who were a bit more ruthless or had other designs. So it became this running joke of these polite Nephandi kind of hanging around in the background, kind of, how to call us if you need us, and generally being very, very nice, even though we totally wanted to wipe out everything we know.
That is such a great idea. These helpful, polite gentlemen who, with your assistance, could end all of reality.
Exactly. And meanwhile, of course, you had the bickering between Sven Hedin and Strindberg, kind of existing on some weird metaphysical plane, not quite alive in the present, but obviously being forces affecting things. And the players becoming very fed up with both of them, realizing that, yeah, we definitely don't want any of these guys running our lives, and especially not affecting our reality. So they were starting to try to figure out ways of getting rid of these euphorial forces.
Oh, that does sound like a very interesting chronicle for players to try to understand and work with.
Yeah, it was very fun. It was also extremely surreal, maybe a bit more surreal than many of my other campaigns. So I did a series of chronicles that were set around Stockholm. The first one was very much based on the locations. I essentially walked around town finding interesting places and interesting people in history and kind of tying together a story about how the player characters are the new recruits for an old decaying chantry in central Stockholm, trying to fight the extremely technocratic reality of modern Sweden. And then the second chronicle, that took place a few years later, and now we're coming into their own. They're starting to get powerful. They're starting to trying to expand the chantry. And the third one, of course, by now they're masters and they're really trying to fight for reality itself. We even got a kind of sequel here about their kids and students set in a near future, slightly dystopian, cyberpunkish version where they're really trying to get around their parents and try to find a new direction.
Oh, that does certainly sound interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of ideas there I would like to further digest. That concept of paradox being very wild and very strange, but also very subjective to the mage who is suffering from it is something I'd like to, an idea I'd like to work with further. But also, when you were talking about walking around the city of Stockholm and seeing that in a new way, that makes me think of a piece you put on Anders' Mage page, and that was the Souls of Cities. I may have the title a bit off, but it was a piece talking about how every large city in the world has its own unique feel, its own unique background, and there may be something like a spirit or a soul of the city itself that a mage can learn more about, interact with, and even influence. Did that have any connection to your time considering the city of Stockholm?
Oh yeah, I think that was the start of it. When that chronicle started going to other places, I had to quickly start thinking about, so what is it like being in other locations? And one of the first things I realized is, of course, the spirit of a small town is different from a big town. And some places have very particular natures. So that led to this thinking about city spirits, which is fairly natural, of course. We have the idea that many locations have their own embodiment or deities. I actually reused it in a more secular way for one of my few commercially published role-playing products, and that is the supplement Cities on the Edge for GURPS Transhuman Space. So there I'm discussing the memes of cities. If you think about Venice, physically it's a collection of buildings sitting in a lagoon, but that's not really what Venice actually is. Venice is about intrigue, it's about history, and it's about Prospero being the Duke of Venice, it's about Napoleon conquering it, it's about masks and decadence and Casanova, and we have all these stories and all these tourist trap ideas about Venice, which is actually keeping the physical city going. Because if this had just been a set of buildings in a lagoon, we would have said, this is so inefficient, let's just go and live somewhere else. But now it's Venice. We're spending enormous resources in Europe to try to keep Venice from flooding. Because it is such a cool place. And that coolness is, of course, all in our minds, or you could say in the spirit world. And the same thing is, of course, true for many other locations. And then you find some locations that are kind of frighteningly spiritless, where nobody actually has a belief about them. It's just an industrial estate. So you need to put your trucks and containers somewhere, and there is not anything there.
I think I do understand what you mean. In my own country of the United States, I've heard some people talk about larger cities in the western half of the country. One person told me about how Phoenix, Arizona is a large and active city, and yet somehow it just feels sort of bland and in some ways empty. The young woman was having a hard time describing it to me, but I think I got a sense of what she was trying to say.
Yeah, I had that experience too. I only briefly visited Phoenix, passing through the city center, and there wasn't anything there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting.
Because sometimes it's interesting because sometimes a corner of an otherwise bland city might, of course, have a lot of intensity. And I think it's not just about what's going on there. It's how much do we actually build up our mental view of it. New York, that is kind of a new great Babylon, and it has a lot of emotions invested in it. It's very powerful as an idea. Even a small place might become a very powerful idea. Just think about Stonehenge. It's not just about aligning ley lines. It's also about people actually believing that Stonehenge matters.
Yes. Yes, I remember when I was reading your piece on the souls of cities for Mage, there was mention of the Japanese city of Kyoto, and at the time I just thought that was an interesting addition to the article, but I had a chance to go to the city of Kyoto and spend some time there on 2 occasions, and your observations were they appeared to be very accurate to me. I remember thinking of your article as I was seeing the city and agreeing with your own findings.
It is fascinating how environments shape people and things. And of course, it's going both directions. And Mage has this wonderful concept that, well, reality is partially shaped by our expectations in a collective way. And I think that's very useful for understanding cities and other big cultural artifacts. Oxford University, for example, is in many ways hilariously inefficient. At the same time, of course, since it's a concept and been going on for 800 years, it keeps on going. It's self-perpetuating. In some sense, it's an extremely powerful spirit, you could say. And it's shaping people's lives around itself. And that also makes great material for Mage, because you have this interesting, both otherworldly thing, these things that are actually shaping our lives in powerful ways. But you might also draw on. You can get power by dressing up in the right way to fit your city.
I see. Well, we are edging a little closer to the 1 hour mark, and because of that, I would like to guide the discussion towards your thoughts on strengths and weaknesses of the game Mage the Ascension. Things it does particularly well, and things where it may have some weaknesses or some gaps. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
I was really impressed with the original traditions, because they managed to cover most of the big magical traditions that exist, different styles of going about it. So while I'm mostly familiar, of course, with Hermetic magic, I know a bit about Wicca and the various mystical practices and shamanism, etc. And most of the things people are doing, you could kind of cram into the traditions. It might take some work, but you could do it. So adding extra traditions, that quite often felt a little bit unnecessary, although some of them, like the Ali Batin, are quite wonderful. The problem was, of course, that the technocracy was intended as the enemy, and I think they might have had a harder time because they didn't base that on particular traditions. So I think some part of the technocracy were really well done. I loved the Syndicate and the New World Order. But then the more technology-oriented ones became kind of a liberal arts parody of what you do in science. And I think one should, if I had done it, I would probably try to slice it slightly differently.
I see. So you are referring to progenitors and Iteration X who focus more on the actual type of scientific research they carry out?
Yeah. I'm not certain you would actually separate them that strongly, because one of the important things in modern science is the idea that it's unified. Yes, physicists and biologists might not really have much to talk to each other about, but both of them kind of agree that they're part of the same domain. And when you move from atomic physics into molecules, you get chemistry, and then enough chemistry turns into biology. And then the biology, we said, yeah, eventually you get to psychology and sociology. We're all working on this big unified field. So it's not entirely clear that it makes sense to just make the progenitors, Iteration X, and the Void Engineers 3 separate conventions. It always felt a little bit like they didn't really know how to. They wanted to have more subgroups, but they did the division that was just by technological specialization, which might not have been mindset. The really interesting thing to me about the Syndicate and the New World Order is that they kind of represent the humanities in some sense. The Syndicate is economics, and then you have the social sciences. And there you have a kind of mindset in how you run things.
I think I understand what you mean.
But it's an interesting challenge on how you divide things into proper groups. Because on one hand, from a technical standpoint, players like having splats. It's so much easier to say, okay, I'm going to make this kind of shaman, but it's not going to be a standard dream speaker. I'm going to make these changes from the standard default. As a game master, it might be convenient saying, yeah, I'm going to make an Iteration X cyborg as an antagonist, but let's give it some quirks to make it a little bit different. But you have some nice starting point. The problem is many of these starting points might become cliches. And then, of course, as more and more details for the setting was added, it became more and more complicated because you needed to take into account a lot of ideas about what the Void engineers were actually doing out there and what are the New World Order plans.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when I was running the technocracy, especially my Sweden-oriented campaign, I actually kept them extremely abstract. Partially because Sweden is such a well-ordered society. This is the place where technocracy has more or less totally won. And that meant that I actually made this creepy thing that the technocracy might have sublimed. It kind of disappeared. It's just part of reality. You actually don't ever get a man in black showing up. There is just the police. There is no syndicate. It's just market forces these days.
Oh, I see. As they've had greater success influencing sleeper society, they are better able to fade into the background and use less direct resources.
Yeah, but I also made this slightly creepy. It's almost as if they succeeded so well that they didn't exist anymore. And this is, of course, going a bit beyond what the normal rules say, because they actually have flesh and blood mages who have a flat somewhere and go to work in an office construct somewhere. But here, they're so successful that they didn't even quite exist.
I see. Yeah, well, I think one of the strengths of the Mage the Ascension game is that there are a lot of gray areas and unanswered questions, and it requires a storyteller to interpret certain things and shape their own chronicle. But of course, other people might say that's a weakness, because when a person plays in one chronicle and then they go across town to a different friend and play in that chronicle, they say, well, hold on, everything's different now. How do I adjust to this?
I think it's quite important before starting a chronicle to set out in a conversation with the players roughly what the idea is, what the boundaries are. And sometimes they can be very, very explicit. So I did one set in the Renaissance. It was a Dark Ages Mage campaign, which was basically what was going on in the background of Romeo and Juliet.
Okay.
So the players were the mages of the town involved in this battle between the families, and they were essentially trying to either get Romeo and Juliet together or separate them. There was a prophecy that if they ever were unified, that would be the end of the town. So some were interested in making sure that this should turn into a tragedy, while others felt, no, young love, this is so cute, and who cares about this darn town anyway? So we had a very firm constraint. There was kind of a Shakespeare structure around it. In some sense, everybody knew what was roughly coming, but it was also contained. That was extremely different from these slightly weird, surreal stories I was telling in some of my Sweden games.
Okay.
And sometimes it's a great thing to just sit down with the players and say, yeah, this game is going to be a tragedy. It's all going to end in tears or worse. And let's decide on that the following assumptions are true about metaphysics.
I see.
Of course, sometimes it's fun to just spring the story on players and don't tell them beforehand what kind of story it is. I ran a superhero game once, so this is outside Mage, but at first it seems to be a low-key superhero game set about people gaining superpowers and trying to deal with the European Union bureaucracy for superpowers. And gradually more and more sinister and cosmic depths were revealed, and it actually turns into a cosmic horror story. And it was epic. The finale, most of my players were very happy with it, and they said, at least we managed to save 40 million people.
I see. So one could say that one of the strengths of Mage is that this loose approach to the setting and to different concepts of the game allow the storyteller a lot of leeway where they can present one idea to their players, and as the game continues, they can subvert that into a very different idea, but not go against the tenets of the game.
Yeah. So I think we have the tenets of Mage in general, and then there are, of course, a particular chronicle, the assumptions as a chronicle you play with your friends. And then inside the game, there are other assumptions. And just like you have laws that are dependent on constitution and there might be norms changing more rapidly, there are some things that you are allowed to change more quickly. You might have a story that changes mood in different parts of a story. You might have a story that's overall a tragedy, but you're moving between different styles of tragedy. And the beautiful thing about Mage is that, given that it's a deeply philosophical game, and this is really why I love it so much, it allows you to think about these meta issues. This is not just a game where people are doing cool stuff, even though that's also true. It's also the consideration and reflection on reality. How do we live? What do cities mean to us? What really are our goals as a group fighting to change the world? Over to the meta questions like authors, the magic, reality itself.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I think that is what attracted many of us to Mage the Ascension. It is set up very well for us to not only run exciting stories with beginnings, middles, and ends, but along the way, there's so much room and so many minor rules in place that allow us to play with ideas and play with the stories themselves, so that you can run a chronicle on two levels. There's what's happening to your characters and what ideas are we all engaging with. And I think that's what attracts and keeps a lot of us interested in the game.
Yeah, definitely. I'm a bit reminded of Neil Gaiman's Sandman the graphical novels, because they, of course, developed in the 90s and in some sense in parallel or a bit after Mage had its real heyday. But I think they're very compatible. And one of the interesting things in Sandman is, of course, the titular Sandman, Dream, the lord of the unreal, and hence also of reality. In a sense, of course, the entire Sandman epic is a reflection about the role of stories in our lives and in shaping reality. So it's exceedingly compatible with Mage, and it's contains so much stuff you can just steal and borrow and transform in Mage.
Yeah, I quite agree. I have that set of graphic novels on my own shelf, and during discussions of Mage the Ascension with friends, it often does come up. It starts in the discussion because it's an example of a story that is a modern-day setting where there are powerful supernatural beings who are on the scene but wish to remain secretive and unnoticed. But as you read the graphic novels and enjoy the story, you start seeing more and more that there are large concepts that humanity has been discussing for hundreds of years that are played with in very, very novel ways. And I do agree with your point that it's a discussion of how people look at stories, how we consider them, how we allow them to influence our lives, and ultimately how important they are to us in the final consideration. So certainly recommend that people pick up Sandman by Neil Gaiman and just explore that if they haven't already read it.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent source. And this deeper issue of stories and thinking about stories, I think is also very healthy both for people who play and people who like to make campaigns, to start exploring various ways of doing storytelling. I remember how my mind was blown when I actually read Vampire for the first time and started pointing out that as a game master, you're doing storytelling. I had grown up thinking about very much having tables for planetary diameters and densities and how long it would take for spacecraft to travel, and having realistic rules for laser rifles. And I finally realized actually nobody really cares about the diameter of a planet in a game or exactly how many joules of energy there is from the laser rifle. The point is, there is a laser rifle. It's doing damage. It's doing something dramatic. Then, of course, the drama might sometimes be nitty-gritty details like in a techno-thriller. And sometimes you just want to be loose because you want to have that personal interaction. Somebody is pointing a weapon at somebody else. Why? What is going to happen next? And the beautiful thing about Mage is that it also takes you to higher and higher levels. You're invited to play around with higher abstractions. Stories have power, so the mages are trying to tell the world stories to shape it into a shape that they believe is the appropriate one. And then, of course, the next question is, where are these ideas about appropriate ones coming? The Celestial Chorus have a story, a kind of neo-Gnostic view of the world. Why do they believe in that? Who told them that story? So it's very fun to have a players start to realize this and start going off deeper and deeper into philosophy. At least if you have players who like that, because others would like to blow up Men in Black and try to save the neighborhood.
Yeah, certainly true. There have been some anecdotes shared of a storyteller who comes to the table and discovers that two of his players want to have car chases and gunfights, and two of the other players want to discuss the nature of dreams and humanity, and they have to try to construct a game that's going to appeal to all of the people at their table. But that I think that can occur to a certain degree with any role-playing game, but with Mage it can come to the forefront more quickly.
The lovely thing about Mage is that you can actually imagine having both things at the same time. You can have a high-paced car chase and the characters having a loud argument as they're firing guns out of windows and doing impossible stunts about, so what was that shot a metaphor for? No, that was not a metaphor. That was just because I wanted to hit that car. So you really believe there is a car pursuing us? In Mage, this actually makes sense. While in many games, you're only allowed to do one of the things.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Mage does have a lot to offer that is more difficult to find in other role-playing games.
I also find it fun to see the problem that causes, of course, when trying to do crossovers. I'm personally not a great fan of doing crossovers across the different World of Darkness settings. But a colleague of mine in Oxford did one, and I had great fun playing a demon. But the sheer incompatibility between the different systems and their assumption of what was going on was also sometimes grating. I was kind of taking it in stride because it fitted my character to actually think that reality was shoddily badly built. He had been around when it was built, and he certainly knew how much corners had been cut, etc. But it takes a very particular kind of group who want to play. Many people get very disturbed when you're not just on the object level reality.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, it reminds me of that older British film Time Bandits, where they explain to the main character at the end of the movie, the whole world was a rush job. It was so poorly done. It was a memorable scene. But
that was exactly that was exactly my character's view. My character was basically the demon of portals, basically the guy who probably built the correspondence point and probably used duct tape to put it all together, and wasn't exactly impressed by how reality was working.
I see. Yeah, on my own, I did like the idea of some crossovers when running Mage the Ascension, but I tried to do crossover light. And by that, what I mean is I didn't try to pull in werewolves with their agenda and vampires with their regular methods of doing things, but I decided to choose, for example, mummies have their own rule set in the World of Darkness, and it's a little easier to mix one or two of those into a Mage Chronicle without losing the focus that a Mage Chronicle usually has on mage factions and metaphysical considerations. And so I think light crossovers can add some interest to the game without sacrificing too much.
Yeah, one needs to be very careful about the effects of crossover. So my colleague's game, which was fun, but it was also a grab bag of things. And I don't necessarily think all tastes blend that well. The nice thing about Mage is, of course, that almost anything can be occurring in that greater Mage world. Mages are poking their noses into other things, but you probably don't need to get into the full vampiric politics and werewolves fighting, because that tends to overshadow stuff. So it's a bit like cooking, actually. You want to add the right spices, but you want to know what the main dish actually is. Just because peanut butter and bananas go well together, and chocolate goes well together with that, and chocolate goes well together with meat, doesn't mean that you should mix it all together.
Yes, I think that's a good metaphor to consider, and very mage-like to put things into a metaphor when discussing it. So extra points for that. Well, I see how we're coming a bit over the 1 hour mark. We do have a little time if there was something further that you would like to discuss with our listeners.
Well, I'm a talkative guy. I tend to talk too much, probably because I've been running role-playing games for so long. And I think one of the best things about being involved in role-playing is, of course, it gives you an enormous improvisation power. So from a career standpoint, being able to make stuff up as I go along has been super useful. As a philosopher, after all, first stretching your brain with science fiction and Mage, and then also learning how to improvise and do a little bit of public speaking, including presenting views that are not your own or that you actually think are totally evil and wrong, but let's try to make a really good argument for them, has been super useful.
That's a good point that you bring up. I have been approached by a number of younger individuals over the years who have asked me, how can I do a good job of running Mage, or what do I need to have as a storyteller to do a good job of running Mage? And they immediately launch into questions about how to do fine-tuned and careful preparation before coming to their game session. And I try to help them understand that one of the ways that you can really become a good mage storyteller, or any sort of a game master for role-playing games, is to improve your improvisational skills. When you have a certain set of ideas, non-player characters planned out, and events for the evening session, you can often get locked into that. And a lot of times the best thing that can happen is a player will do something totally unexpected that requires you to react. And when you are reacting, that's when you have a chance to improvise. And all sorts of interesting things can develop right there at the gaming table. So don't be afraid of it. Lean into it. And the more you do it, the better you will get at it, and the less you will be apprehensive about having to improvise.
Totally agree. Another lovely way of preparing for improvisation is to, instead of having detailed plans, you just have a long list of things that would be cool or elements that you might want to throw in. And it could be something like a weird verbal tick for a non-player character, except that you don't know which non-player character is going to have that verbal tick, but you have one ready. You might have come up with a really cool disaster, or a really, really gory description of something horrible happening, and you have that list at the side. So when you get the chance, you're ready. Suddenly you can throw in the thing, and it seems, since you have been planning it a little bit ahead, like you're really ready and you're improvising like a god. Well, of course, it was just something you dreamt up last week.
Oh, I see. So perhaps we could help people with the suggestion that you take one separate sheet of paper and you just write idea list at the top, and you write down certain ideas, like a person like this, a speech pattern like this, the notion of Loki from Norse mythology, and just have a list of unrelated ideas. Have it next to them as they are running the game session, and when something unexpected occurs, they simply look at the idea list and say, I'm going to react with something off this list. This could be fun.
Exactly. And the beauty of it is you can, of course, tailor this list a little bit to the style of a game and the story you're trying to have. So, for example, if you want to have Norse mythology show up, you write down a few names from Norse mythology and a few references. And when somebody says, okay, I'm heading over to the diner, you offhandedly mention it's called Loki's Diner.
I see.
Well, it was named maybe because the owner just liked more Norse mythology. There's nothing more magical about that. It's not necessarily that it actually is the god Loki behind the till, although that might also be an interesting thing if it's a diner in the really wrong part of Valhalla. But this way, you can also bias the game in the right direction, or add subtle hints that sound like you're extremely smart, but actually you're having a sheet of papers with good ideas.
Every good storyteller understands the idea of cheating.
Yeah, and it's not cheating when it adds to the story. For example, one of the classic problems is playing really smart NPCs. And the standard storyteller trick is, of course, to steeple your fingers and say, just according to plan.
Aha.
Because whatever the players do, they actually have planned for that. Of course, you had no idea what the players would come up with. So unless it's exceedingly smart or exceedingly unlikely, you can always claim that, yes, the super genius had a plan for that too.
Method to the madness. I like that. I like that idea of having a theme or a set of ideas that you want to work all through your chronicle, but you don't have to carefully plan each scene and each interaction ahead of time. You just have a list of ideas and different words and names associated with this concept you want in your chronicle, and then at the table, every once in a while you'll look over at that list and say, well, this would be a good time to mention Balder from Norse mythology, or hey, this is a great time to put in a lamppost that looks suspiciously like Odin's spear. And so you don't have to plan every detail ahead of time. You can just let it come out as you are there, but your list of ideas next to your dice is helping you. It's giving you a little bit of support.
Yeah, and all the ideas that you don't use, you can of course reuse because the players don't know that they were on your list. So next game, well, if you continue the same setting, you can still continue using, let's say, the Norse mythology. Or maybe it turns out that now the issues are different, but you just pick over those ideas that make sense in the new setting. So sometimes there are these scenes that I've been thinking about for ages and I had no idea where to put them in. So I had this vision of a bike being frozen into a block of ice, for example. That was just a picture in my mind, and I was carrying it around for several years, up until a point I needed a MacGuffin in one of my campaigns. And of course, it turns out that the big artifact that is so important, that turns out to be the frozen bike. It's apparently some kind of conceptual artwork that has some weird power. Nobody really understands what it's good for, but it's a really cumbersome artifact because you need a freezer to transport it around. It's probably not a good idea to let it out. Some of the bad guys seem to want to melt the ice, maybe because that will unleash the bike, or maybe it's because they will destroy an artwork. The players didn't know. Nobody really knew. I didn't know. But it was such a good image, and I was wanting to use it for ages.
Okay, so you don't have to have all the answers as a storyteller. You just have to have a desire to find them.
Yeah, and sometimes, of course, during a chronicle, they start getting a meaning. So, for example, that particular chronicle was set in a mildly dystopian near future and was dealing partially with the offspring of the player characters from the previous campaign. So now the old the PCs were NPCs, and they were kind of getting slightly weird and sinister, and the next generation are trying to find the path. And in particular, two of the former play characters had really gone off the deep end. One had become a Nephandi, and one was a mayor in the cult of ecstasy guy, going more and more extreme in a somewhat dark direction. And then they had a kid. This kid, of course, had grown up with no concept of normal reality and was basically a little cute marauder who had a very strong tendency to slip between layers of fiction. The players had actually to save him several times from getting lost in storybooks. And then there was this magnificent finale of that campaign, basically all the forces in the Mage universe converging on this big, it was actually a football cup winner celebration in central Stockholm, and the technocracy of Nephandi and everybody were kind of trying to influence it. And that frozen bike was the focus. And even at the end, where it did whatever it did, nobody, not me, not the players, not anybody in the setting, really understood what it was. It was that ultimate mystery, but it was partially used to get that family together. They kind of disappeared. Maybe they ascended, maybe they found a way of unifying traditions, Nephandi and Marauders. Nobody really understood what it was, and they decided, let's keep it a mystery because we don't want to go there. It was epic. And it was also so good because we didn't need to have answers. It needed to work as magic.
I think I understand.
It was very interesting also because doing a good ending of a chronicle is, of course, a super big challenge. And one of the big issues in role-playing games in general is that unless you railroad it, which is very hard because players are creative, it's hard to get that nice structure of a story. You can try to set things up so you get to a good climax and finale, but doing a good denouement that have the players now go back to their ordinary life as reality-bending magicians, that's tricky. So having a lot of components playing around them and trying to see how we can fit into a finale, it's tricky. I find as a game master that I'm in about 50% of cases, I'm happy how a chronicle ends. In other cases, well, maybe good enough. It's very hard to do right, but when it works, it kind of clicks. And I think improvisation has a lot to do with it. It's very rare that you can plan a perfect finale.
I see. More about putting the pieces in place to allow it to happen rather than architecting every moment.
Yeah, and sometimes it's the small things. Like in that particular finale, the representative of technocracy, the man in white, kind of did a decent thing. He kind of shook the hands with one of the mages and then disappeared to wherever he went. It's just a small symbolic thing that at least we were all on the forces of normality and sanity versus that really grand weirdness that was going on with the Nephandi and Marauders and Frozen Bike. At least we can agree on this. And that felt very satisfying. Similarly, it was satisfying to get a bunch of characters disappearing off into the sunset, so to say, in a useful way, as well as leaving a lot of mystery. But this depends on the players. I can totally imagine a slightly different set of players who would have been so unhappy with that ending. So knowing your players, I think, besides improvisation, actually figuring out what people go for, I think that is also a real skill that you need to develop as a storyteller.
Yeah, I would quite agree. Yeah, understanding not only the characters that your players have brought to the game, but also what your players would like to see and how they would like to approach things, I think is also very important. Well, it's just such a shame that we don't have actual play recording of this chronicle you're describing, because I, for one, would certainly like to hear it. But even though we can't hear it, I'm so glad that you were available today to tell us about it and share your thoughts on Mage the Ascension. I've really enjoyed talking with you today, and I realized your schedule as a research fellow is going to keep you just a little busy, but is there any possibility in the future that we could contact you again, because you just have so much to share with our listeners about Mage the Ascension that it would be a shame never to hear from you again?
I would be delighted. This conversation had made me realize that so much is still lying around in my the scattered notes and in my the vague memories, that bringing it up to the surface makes me realize, maybe I should run a campaign again. Maybe at least a little one-shot. It's been too long now.
Well, if you ever consider any online gaming, then certainly let us know at Mage the Podcast, because if we don't help people to view records of that or get involved with it, we would certainly like to know about it. That would be very enjoyable. A lot of people have gained a lot from the pieces you've put onto Anders' Mage page, and it's makes me feel better to know that you still have something to discuss and something to offer Mage fans regarding that game. Well, unfortunately, as much as I have greatly enjoyed this discussion, I feel it may be time to draw this to a close. So let's just say that the possibility is there that we'll hear from you again. But for today, I would like to thank you for sparing some time from your schedule and discussing these things with us. I'd like the audience to know that this has been an episode of Mage the Podcast. You can find us online at magethepodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter. That is at Mage the Podcast, all together. Please subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, and something to consider, if you've enjoyed the episode today, there may be other people who would enjoy it too. And if you give us a review on iTunes, it makes our show that much easier for other people to find. You can also find us on Google Play and the TuneIn app. Thank you so much for your time today, listening to Mage the Podcast. My name is Adam Simpson. I've been joined by Dr. Anders Sandberg in Oxford, UK. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you enjoy your games as much as we enjoy ours.
Towards Ascension.
Certainly, towards Ascension.